Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Church of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're on day 101, and we're covering Orientalium Ecclesiatum 15 to 18 on the liturgy and the marriage in the East. So if you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday we talked about the role and power of patriarchs and archbishops. Today we're talking about a number of things around the liturgy, such as the Sunday obligation, the permanent diaconate, confessions, and marriage. This is the second part of the section, the discipline of the sacraments. This will conclude this section. So let's begin right with paragraph 15, which is about the Sunday obligation in the East. So let's read it. The faithful are bound to take part on Sundays and feast days in the divine liturgy, or according to the regulations or custom of their own right in the celebration of the divine office. That the faithful may be more easily to fulfill their obligation, it is laid down the period of time within which the precept should be observed extends from vespers of the vigil to the end of Sunday or feast day. The faithful are eagerly exhorted to receive Holy Communion in these days, and indeed more frequently, even daily. So before we go on, a few notes here. Divine liturgy is what the Christians of the Eastern Church generally call the Eucharist celebration. We in the West would more often just call it Mass. That's what we mean by divine liturgy. We mean the Eucharist celebration of the Mass. Divine office would be prayers, reading the Psalms, in common things, something along those lines. That varies significantly, in different rites as well, but that kind of thing. And like when Father Shabbat noted that in the Chaldean rite, they start with a long liturgy of the hours, right? The divine office, they don't just start right with Mass or the divine liturgy. And that's, and this paragraph is really telling you similar to a Holy Day of Obligation in the Roman Catholic Church. Different churches have it slightly differently. It may not be in the sense of like as strict an obligation where missing it is a grave matter. So if it's done willfully and, knowingly, it's mortal sin. That kind of distinction, it's not nearly as hard and fast necessarily in all those churches. They might have some rule, like if you miss 2 or 3 consecutive Sundays, then it's an issue. But if you miss one because of something happened, it's not nearly as much of an issue. It just varies a little bit by church. And I don't know the exact rules of the different churches. I know some Orthodox churches, which are similar kind of discipline to them, have rules like that where it's not necessarily you have to be there absolutely every Sunday. And it's also that, the kind of like you have to be here from this time to this time. We Romans try to make it like you have to be here from like the beginning of the first reading until, the closing hymn or something like that. Whereas they are much more, much less hard and fast about that in general. And obviously it gives us a long time from Vespers on the day before, so sunset the day before, until the end of that day, and then frequent communion is also encouraged. Paragraph 16 is on about confessions, and it's not so much about the practice of confession, but about the right to hear confession. So as a priest, I need permission from the bishop to hear confessions. There's a slight distinction in the U.S. versus the general norms on this. So if I have from my provincial, who's not a bishop, but then I also need it from the bishop where I live. But then after that, in most parts of the world, if I have it from my bishop, I have it unless I'm explicitly excluded in some other place. Like if some diocese doesn't like the legionaries, they can exclude all legionaries, fairly straightforward. But in the U.S., the norms are different. You're assumed to be excluded unless you have permission. Even in the U.S., though, like if you ask me for confession, let's say I was traveling. Let's say I was going from Calgary, where my home is, up in Western Canada, over to the East Coast, and I had to stop over in like Dallas and Minneapolis. I've never had permission to do any ministry in Minneapolis, for example. And you can still like, hey, Father, can you hear my confession? I can still hear it because it's not like I'm not seated for confession. I'm not presenting myself for confession. I'm just walking around the airport, with my 2-hour layover, just, dressed normally as a priest. But anyways, that's the thing. So here the idea is the right to hear confession in the whole territory. And so let's read the text. Owing to the fact that the faithful of different individual churches dwell intermingled with each other in the same area or Eastern territory, the faculty of hearing confessions duly and with restriction given to priests of any right by their own hierarchs extend to the whole territory of him who grants them, and also the places and the faithful of any other right in the same territory, unless the hierarch of the place explicitly excluded this from for places of his right. So with this, let's say the Maronite Church needed more confessors for some event they're doing, they can ask me to help them out. And then we need more confessors at the Roman Catholic parish, we can ask the Maronite priest to help us out, basically. So if you have permission from your local bishop, that's allowed. This is basically all that's saying. You can have confessions across rites, which is very helpful. I've not done it a ton, but, I have gone to confession with a non-Roman Catholic priest. I've heard confessions of non-Roman Rite Catholics at times, but it's not like something I'm doing all the time. So paragraph 17 is about restoring lower orders. If you remember back to Sacrosanctum Concilium, we talked about the restoration of the permanent diaconate in the Roman Rite. This is basically the same thing in the East, but the East, it's a little less dramatic because at least in the Byzantine tradition, it had generally been kept, the lower rite. And so we're going to read it and then a very brief explanation because we already explained it when we did Sacrosanctum Concilium. In order that the ancient established practice of the sacrament of orders in the Eastern churches may flourish again, this sacred council ardently desires that the office of the permanent diaconate should, where it has fallen into disuse, be restored. The legislative authorities of each individual church should decide about the subdiaconate and the minor orders and the rights and obligations that attach to them. So, right, that's straightforward. That first sentence is very straightforward. Restore the permanent diaconate like we have. Now, the second sentence is a little more confusing. It talks about the minor orders and the subdiaconate and the rights and obligations attached to them. So, in the Roman Rite, after the council, it was determined to rename these from minor orders to ministries. So you have the ministries of lector and acolyte not for validity, but for laicity and doing it proper. You have to receive these before you receive the diaconate. Usually, the Vatican has mentioned the possibility of people doing them outside the seminary, although in practice, the only place I've seen them done is in the seminary. And they're kind of preparing you for that idea. And at different times, there'd be different numbers in the East and different permutations in the East will have different numbers and call them different names. But that's the idea, is those preparatory the preparatory minor orders or ministries, and they can have different ones in different rites. It's not because these are a small T tradition. It's good to have something as preparatory, so it's not just, hey, I'm confirmed and I'm ordained a deacon. But exactly what those are is not something of, apostolic tradition, divine command, or anything like that. So rites can vary in that. So paragraph 18 is going to summarize marriages in the East. One thing to note that kind of came up in our discussion with Father Shaba, but we kind of glossed over, is that there's a difference in our understanding of the theology of the sacrament of marriage. So in any sacrament, there is a minister, right? And so the minister is the one imparting the sacrament. If I am baptizing a baby, I'm the minister of the baptism. If in an emergency situation, some layperson is baptizing the baby, they're the minister of the baptism. And the minister of marriage is actually a debated point. We accept both, but there's a slightly different understanding in that in the Roman Catholic Rite, the general understanding is that when a couple says, I, John, take you, Jane, to be my wife, they're imparting it on their spouse. Like John is imparting on Jane, and then Jane imparts on John immediately afterwards, right? So that mutual exchange of consent is the moment of imparting it, and they impart it on each other. They're minister for each other. And the priest or deacon is there as the official witness to record it for the church, to keep track, because, we have to keep track of these things. So guys can't run off and go to other places and marry other women without, leave their wife and things like that. We want to prevent that, right? Whereas in the East, the general understood, sacramental theology is that when the priest gives the blessing after they've given their consent, that is the moment of imparting the sacrament. Now, and for that, they need a priest generally for an Eastern Catholic marriage and not just a deacon. Like in the Roman Catholic Rite, we can have marriage with just a deacon. And canon law, even our Eastern canon, says you need to have a priest if one of the people is Orthodox or Eastern Catholic to, rather than just a deacon, who can do marriages in most cases in Roman Catholic Church. So anyways, let's just read the text. To obviate invalid marriages when Eastern Catholics marry baptized Eastern non-Catholics in order to promote fidelity in the sanctity of marriage, as well as peace within the family, the Sacred Council determines that the canonical form for the celebration of these marriages is obligation only for laicity. For their validity, the presence of a sacred minister is sufficient provided the other prescriptions of law are observed. So obviate means here keep from happening. We want to avoid, invalid marriages. So here it's basically saying, and then the canonical form here. Canonical form is, as a Catholic, you need to follow a Catholic wedding, or you need to get permission to have a non-Catholic wedding from the bishop and things like that, right? And the idea with that is that we as the church want to make sure that people don't just leave their spouse and run off. When you get married, they go back to where your baptismal certificate is kept, and they add a thing on the file that you're married, right? And so if you want to get remarried, they go back there and they go, no, you can't get married, right? So mine's at a parish in Calgary, and St. Thomas More Parish. And at St. Thomas More Parish will say, I made my final vows, I've been ordained a priest. And so if I escaped and went across the country and tried to, get myself married, present my baptismal certificate, and then they go and check with St. Thomas More and no, this guy can't get married. Why? He's a religious professor. He's a priest. He's never been excused from the vows and from the clerical state, right? And those same things we want to make sure with lay people. So this is, and this is a lot of taking care, making sure there's not secret weddings, and we know what it is, and things like that. But anyway, so here the idea is it's needed for laicity, not for validity. Laicity means that it's the right way to do things if it's licit, whereas validity means if it's not done this way, it's not valid. So for example, if two Catholics without permission of the bishop go and get married at a courthouse, it's not valid. It's not even really a marriage. It legally is a marriage, but it isn't in reality. And so that's the idea. Hopefully that's helpful. And so thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce and other great podcasts, sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we're going to continue with the next paragraph, Orientalium Ecclesiarum, which is 19 to 23 on each rite has control over their own liturgy. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which will provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, like playlists on individual documents or reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X.
Amen.